Every time he walked by, he'd reach out, touching my shoulder, my arm, even trying to grab me. I pushed him away repeatedly, but no one around me did anything. People just watched. Finally, a kind man offered me his seat and went to find the ticket inspector. I thought I was safe, but the man kept pacing, passing by me again and again, each time brushing against me. When the inspector arrived, the man bolted. I was left shaken but relieved. I'll never forget how helpless I felt that day. To everyone out there, stay vigilant. You never know when danger might find you. The train yard encounter, it was supposed to be just another quiet night of tagging a break from the monotony of my daily grind. A way to feel alive. The train yard was my sanctuary, the tracks my canvas. Under the cover of darkness, I found freedom in creating something vibrant on the cold, lifeless steel of train cars. Paul, my best friend, joined me that night. Not because he shared my love for graffiti, but because we always had each other's backs. He was my anchor, keeping the silence from becoming too oppressive. The train yard stretched out before us like a labyrinth. The cars lined up in endless rows. Moonlight bathed the scene, casting long shadows that danced with every slight movement. The air was thick with the scent of rust and oil, and the faint hum of distant traffic was the only thing breaking the stillness. I tossed Paul a spray can, nudging him. "Come on, give it a shot," I urged. He snorted, shaking his head as he leaned against one of the train cars, already lighting a joint. "You know this isn't my thing," he said with a grin, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Suit yourself," I replied, rolling my eyes before turning my attention to the blank metal canvas. The artwork, the first hiss of spray paint hitting metal, sent a thrill through me. As I worked, the colors came alive under the moonlight, bold reds and blues streaking across the faded, rusted surface. Each line, each curve, was an extension of myself. This wasn't just vandalism, it was my art, my voice in a world that often felt deafeningly quiet. Paul stayed in his spot, content to watch, occasionally throwing out a sarcastic comment or two about my masterpiece. By the time I was 3 tags in, my hands were streaked with paint, and my mind was buzzing with satisfaction. The clatter of empty spray cans falling onto the tracks punctuated the night. "You're missing out, man," I said, turning to him. "Yeah, sure," Paul said, waving me off as he rolled another joint. The night wore on with laughter and lighthearted conversation. Then, it happened. The noise, it started as a faint metallic clang, almost too subtle to notice. But in the stillness of the train yard, it was like a crack of thunder. Both of us froze, the sound cutting through the easy rhythm of the night. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Paul shrugged, though his face betrayed the unease I felt creeping into my chest. We stood there, straining our ears, scanning the shadows. The train yard suddenly felt much larger, its shadows much darker. "Probably just the wind," Paul muttered, though the tremor in his voice told me he didn't believe it. A second clang echoed, louder this time and closer. My pulse quickened as I pulled out my phone, starting a video recording. "Bro, I swear I heard something," I whispered into the mic. And then, the figure appeared. The figure emerging from the shadows, it moved with purpose. I couldn't make out its face, but its movements were deliberate and menacing. The figure bent down, grabbed one of the empty spray cans I tossed aside, and hurled it toward us with unnerving accuracy. The can missed Paul by inches, clattering against the train car behind him. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking with panic. We bolted, adrenaline surging through our veins. Behind us, the figure let out a guttural yell, its voice gravelly and filled with rage. "You better not trip, boy," It snarled, its words chasing us into the night. And then came the gunshot. The sharp crack of the bullet echoed through the train yard, louder than anything I'd ever heard. My ears rang as fear took over completely. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep running. Paul wasn't so lucky. His foot caught on the uneven tracks, sending him sprawling forward. "Get up! Keep going!" I screamed, reaching back to grab him. He scrambled to his feet, and we didn't stop until we hit the main road. Even then, we kept moving, our breaths ragged, our legs burning. The escape, by the time we reached my car, we were shaking, our minds spinning with disbelief. Paul leaned against the hood, trying to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his face pale. I shook my head, still clutching my phone. The recording was still running, though I doubted it had captured anything useful. "Call the cops?" Paul asked hesitantly. I hesitated, knowing what he was thinking. "And tell them what?" "That we were trespassing and tagging train cars when some lunatics shot at us?" He didn't reply, and we sat there in silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The return weeks passed before I could bring myself to go back to the train yard. But the questions gnawed at me. Who was that person? Why were they there? And why did they react so violently? This time, I went during the day, the bright sunlight offering a false sense of security. I wasn't taking any chances, though. My Glock 17 was tucked securely into my waistband. The train yard looked the same, but felt different, less like a sanctuary and more like a crime scene. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning every shadow. When I reached the train cars, my stomach dropped. My tags were gone, painted over with jagged, haphazard blotches of red. The sight filled me with anger and unease. Someone had deliberately erased my work. As I moved down the line, I noticed one of the car doors was open. The discovery, the inside of the car, was stark and unsettling. In the center of the empty space sat a single chair, its metal legs scuffed and worn. Chains and ropes lay scattered around it, some looped around the chair's legs, others coiled haphazardly on the floor. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of bleach, the chemical tang burning my nostrils. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, my hands trembling. Before I could, the metallic clang echoed again, this time from somewhere further down the tracks. My blood turned to ice. I didn't wait to see what or who had made the noise. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I obeyed, bolting from the train yard without looking back. The questions I've told this story to anyone who will listen, but no one can make sense of it. Some say it was just a homeless person, desperate and territorial. Others think it might have been something more sinister. But the questions remain. Why were my tags covered? Who set up the chair and chains? And what was the bleach for? Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows creep in, I find myself haunted by the memory. I hear the gunshot in my dreams, feel the cold metal of the spray can in my hand. And sometimes, in the silence, I hear the clang again like a warning, echoing in the dark corners of my mind. But the chair is what I can't forget. Who or what was meant to sit in it? My name is Valor. I'm 24 years old, and what I'm about to share was the most unsettling experience of my life. I've lived and worked in New York City for several years, relying heavily on the subway as my main mode of transportation. It's a staple of city life, a convenience I'd grown accustomed to. Despite the occasional oddity, I'd never felt truly unsafe until one chilling Saturday night. It was late, maybe around 1 a.m., and I was heading home after a lively gathering at a friend's place. The city was unusually quiet for a weekend. with the streets sparsely populated. The air had an unusual bite to it, almost as if the city itself was holding its breath. I descended the steps into the subway station, the echo of my own footsteps my only companion. This particular station was smaller and more enclosed than most, with walls that seemed to close in the deeper you went. It had always felt a little eerie, but tonight, the silence was oppressive. As I swiped my Metro card and pushed through the turnstile, a strange sensation washed over me, a kind of prickling awareness that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but the station behind me was empty. Shaking it off as paranoia, I made my way to the platform. The air on the platform was cold and unnaturally still, with only the faint hum of electricity running through the tracks. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, one of them flickering at irregular intervals. I was alone. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it. Late-night solo rides were part of city life. But there was something different about this night. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the shadows in the corners of the station seemed darker than usual, as though they were alive, watching. Occasionally, I'd hear a distant metallic clang echo through the tunnels, sharp and intrusive against the stillness. I told myself it was probably maintenance work, but the sound set my nerves on edge. The train wasn't due for another 10 minutes, so I sat down on a bench, pulling out my phone to distract myself. The glow of the screen felt comforting in the dim, almost claustrophobic space. The emptiness around me seemed to amplify every little sound, the rustle of my jacket as I shifted on the bench, the faint scuff of my shoe against the concrete. Then, breaking the monotony, a voice cut through the stillness, soft but deliberate. "Hey, over here, buddy." I froze. The voice was raspy, almost a whisper, but it carried an edge that made my skin crawl. Slowly, I looked up and scanned the platform. Nothing. My pulse quickened as I glanced toward the tunnel. At first, I saw only darkness. But then, stepping into the dim light just beyond the platform's edge, I saw him. The man was tall and thin, his frame swallowed by a tattered coat that hung loose on his shoulders. His face was gaunt, his skin a sickly pallor, and his smile. Oh, that smile. Yellowed teeth, some missing altogether, stretched wide as he stared at me. His eyes were unblinking, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I looked away quickly, pretending not to notice him, hoping he'd lose interest. But instead, he chuckled a low, unsettling sound that echoed around me like a predator circling its prey. My heart raced as I tried to focus on my phone, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. Seconds later, another figure emerged from the tunnel. This man was shorter, stockier, with wild eyes and a crooked grin. He carried a kind of manic energy that made my knees spike. "Come hang out with us in the tunnel," he called, his voice laced with malice. My grip on the bench tightened. I didn't respond, didn't move, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Why were they here? What did they want? Their presence felt suffocating, like the darkness itself was closing in around me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The taller man stepped back into the tunnel, disappearing into the shadows. My breath hitched, my body rigid with tension. Seconds later, he returned, dragging something or someone with him. At first, my mind refused to register what I was seeing. The shape he dragged was twisted and limp, vaguely human but horrifyingly wrong. It wasn't a person. It was a grotesque effigy, cobbled together from scraps of cloth and other things. The face was a patchwork of mismatched features, a crude mockery of humanity. My stomach turned, and I fought the urge to retch. Was this some kind of sick joke? A prank to scare late-night commuters? The men stared at me, their eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of amusement. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat loud enough to drown out every other sound. Then I heard it, the rumble of the train approaching in the distance. Relief surged through me like a tidal wave. I jumped to my feet, my legs unsteady but ready to move the moment the train arrived. As the train's headlights pierced the darkness, the second man stepped closer to the edge of the platform, holding his macabre creation high. His smile stretched wider, his eyes unblinking as he seemed to revel in my terror. The train screeched to a halt, its doors opening with a metallic hiss. I stumbled inside, the bright fluorescent lights of the car feeling like a sanctuary. My hands trembled as I gripped a pole for support, my breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. As the train began to move, I glanced out the window, unable to resist the urge to look back. And there they were, pressed against the railing at the edge of the platform. But it wasn't just the two of them anymore. There were more, 4, maybe 5 men now, all staring, their faces inches from the glass. Their eyes bore into mine, unblinking, their expressions a twisted blend of hatred and glee. My blood ran cold as I realized they were mouthing something. I couldn't hear the words, but the rhythmic movement of their lips was unmistakable, like a chant or a curse. Their hands pressed against the railing, their fingers clawing at the air as though trying to reach me. The train picked up speed, leaving the station behind, but their faces remained etched in my mind. Even as the city lights blurred past, I couldn't shake the feeling that their gaze was still on me, following me into the night. The rest of the ride was a blur. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. By the time I reached my stop, my body felt like lead, my nerves frayed to the point of exhaustion. I practically ran up the stairs to the surface, the cold night air biting at my face as I emerged onto the street. I've taken the subway countless times since that night, but I can't set foot in that particular station again. Even now, years later, the memory lingers like a dark shadow, a reminder that sometimes the city's underbelly hides things far more terrifying than we can imagine. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but one thing is certain. That night, I came face to face with something profoundly wrong, something I can't explain. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget their faces pressed against the glass, watching me leave.